As an information systems auditor, we must be familiar with many different types of information systems. These include point-of-sale systems, those systems which are used to process credit cards and debit cards when we make a purchase at a merchant. These types of credit card purchasing systems have been the subject of many types of attacks over the last few years. This has led to the theft of tens of millions of credit card and debit card information, as well as, of course, the theft of PIN numbers through an attack known as swiping. The risks associated with point-of-sale systems are the types of memory scraping software that is often installed on these devices, which will then scrape off or capture the actual credit card information while it's temporarily being held in memory at the point at which the transaction is being authorized. This type of memory scraping software is often able to be installed on these devices because the vendor who installed or implemented the system did not properly remove things like the vendor supplied default accounts and passwords. Therefore, if a person gains access to these systems, they can easily install that memory scraping software. There have also been many attacks related to the alteration of the device. These devices are built so they're very difficult to take apart without destroying then the cryptographic operations inside them. They are tamper-proof devices. However, the thieves have learned how to circumvent some of those tamper-proof protections, and this has allowed them in some cases to alter the device also to capture information. They've inserted things like SIM cards, and then these have been able then to capture the information to be then extracted via a simple phone call. In fact, we have seen several of these devices were actually then infected or altered even during the original manufacturing process. In many cases, these devices are installed in very open, publicly accessible places. They're easily able to be stolen or altered with if someone is not paying attention. They also, quite often, are installed on an insecure architecture. These devices should be on a secure subnet, isolated from the other parts of the organization, behind firewalls as a screened subnet. They should definitely not be on the same part of the network as other non-critical services such as email and other services within the organization. So all of these require attention by the auditor to look for how is the device actually implemented, installed, operated, to ensure that we have tracking to see if a device was then switched out or stolen, and to make sure it's operating on a secure architectural format. We also have, of course, the world of electronic banking. This includes things like, transferring money from one account to another through EFT systems. The risks associated with this, obviously, are identity theft, authentication, and non-repudiation, where a person is able to log in as somebody else and access their bank account. They steal their identity and are able then to access their funds. A lack of authentication, where a person has logged into a site that they thought was their bank but wasn't. And the problem here of establishing non-repudiation, so a person can't later turn around and say, well, no, I didn't authorize that transfer. There can be a lot of unauthorized transactions, and we've seen many governments, central banks, and individuals have definitely been victims of this, where someone has been able to initiate a wire transfer or a transfer of funds as a theft, where that person was not authorized to actually then do that. The other issue, of course, is the integrity of the transaction, to make sure that the amount that's being transferred cannot then be changed by somebody later on, or where the money that was being transferred gets switched over to a different account. Part of this is where the auditor has to ensure we have then audit trails, we have logs of all of the activity on the system, so we know that the system is being operated securely, and we have ways to ensure then that we have tracking of who actually then initiated some type of a funds transfer. We also have electronic payment systems, and there's several types of these, such as payment gateways, such as PayPal, for example, where the payment for an organization is actually then being handled on their behalf by PayPal, operating as a third-party service provider. You then have electronic money transfers. This is something that, for example, Western Union does. A person that is in one country can transfer money to another location where it can be picked up at a Western Union location. This allows us to be able to move money effortlessly around the world through what we call then a form of electronic payment and money transfer. We've also seen many risks associated with prepaid cards, where a person goes into a shop, purchases a type of gift card that they can give then that would have a certain monetary value on it. These prepaid cards then are preloaded with a certain amount of money that, well, should only allow the recipient to access that amount of money of the value of the card. But we've seen several attacks against these, where thieves have been able to break into the underlying systems, and as a result of that, they've been able then to pull money out off of prepaid cards far in excess of what the value of the card was. We've also had a number of cases of fraudulent issuing of different types of prepaid cards. Where would we be today without automated teller machines? The ease of being able to pick up money fairly simply, where we can then go to an ATM that doesn't even belong to our bank or is not even in our country, and have the ability now to be able to access the funds in our own account in our own country. But obviously there are a number of different risks associated with the use of ATMs. Well, for one, the theft of the machine itself. These machines contain an immense amount of money, and if a person could steal the entire unit, well, they have access to that cash. There's also, of course, the problem of a person who is using an ATM being overseen, or, for example, that money being then taken from them, or they're being coerced into then accessing their account and providing money as well. We've also seen a number of locations where their ATMs were installed with insecure configurations. In Canada, for example, we had one major bank was found that they installed over 4,000 ATMs, and they still had the vendor supplied default password for the administrator access to those ATMs on all of those units. This allowed a couple of 12-year-old boys to be able to access and gain administrator access to those ATMs. These are the sorts of things as auditors we should be checking on. Are these sorts of functionality and these types of services still active that definitely should have been removed? We've also had cases where a person has put in, especially in a shopping mall, a fake ATM. A machine that looks like a small little ATM. They wheel in as a portable on a little cart, plug it in, and then as people approach it to take money out, all it does is capture then their card information and PIN numbers, and then replies back with an error saying, "I'm sorry, we've had a problem, please try again later." This allows them then to capture all that information. A few days later, they come, pick up the machine, wheel it back out, and now have all of that data that's on it from everybody who tried to use that machine. There's also the security of our customers. An ATM should be installed in a fairly secure, well-lit, and easily observable location, where we have cameras, we have the ability of someone to see if there's anything suspicious in that area. Having cameras is important, both to monitor the area where the ATM is, but also most ATMs have a camera installed on them that will capture the image of the person that's actually using the ATM. This can be quite valuable if we have to deal with some type of fraudulent transaction, or where a person is denied that they were the person that actually then executed that transaction. A lot of our systems today are based on integrated voice response systems. This allows us to call up a merchant and be able to right away select from a number of different options. For example, quite often it'll welcome us to that merchant, and then we would have to press 1 for English, 2 for Spanish, 3 for French, for example. We have also with integrated voice response where we can interact then with the system to get certain types of services or information, such as what is our current balance on our credit card, or what was the last date we made a payment. These IVR systems allow us in many cases to simulate the same type of activity or support we would have had if we were dealing with a real human expert. We call them expert systems because they are going through the steps and logic that a human would have done in that situation as well. This saves an awful lot of, should we say, labor-intensive work, where the system, by accepting our response as an input, is able to provide a certain type of support for us. These support us as customers. Quite often they'll identify the phone numbers we're calling from. They'll allow us to interact with the various services provided by that merchant in a way then that the merchant can provide much more expeditious service for us, but if there's still a problem, then route us to a real human operator. But the risks and controls related to IVR systems would certainly be errors in the logic. You may have had the situation where you were calling into a merchant and you end up in an endless loop that never actually took you to the service that you were wanting, or where the logic did not work correctly and you ended up now with a type of error in the information you actually received. We have to protect the rule base that's used by IVR systems to make sure that the rules are accurate and we will not have any type of unauthorized change that could mean that those rules quite simply ended up not providing then the correct information to the person trying to use the system. We have a lot of image processing systems used today to scan documents and store them electronically. For example, a large effort in the last few years has been taking a lot of documents that have been used in courts and governments, and these types of services, the documents that have been stored for many years in warehouses, and scan them all in. This has a few advantages, the first being that it means we do not have to store all of that paper anymore, but it also has the advantage that if there was ever to be a fire, we're not going to lose all of those records that were only stored in paper. The other advantage is now we can search through them. They can become accessible online. And a document, for example, a marriage certificate or a death certificate from maybe 100 years ago, now becomes accessible by people looking it up, whereas before we'd scanned it in, that quite simply was not possible. So we can search through these electronic documents. We reduce the amount of paper we have, but are there risks? Absolutely. When we look at storing things electronically, what happens if the data itself was to be corrupted? What happens if the system that was storing this data had some type of interruption? This is where we have to make sure we have backups of the electronic storage as well. The other thing is that we've seen a lot of changes in technology within the last 30-40 years. From moving from floppy disks to, of course, to CDs and DVDs, to tapes, all of the various types of storage media we've had. Now the question comes, if technology continues to change, will the documents that I've scanned in today still be accessible 20 years from now? Will we still have the technology to read these files, for example? There's also the risk now that maybe some data I didn't want disclosed becomes accessible. The risk now of unauthorized access to information as well, where a person, because things are accessible through networks, may get access into areas that are still sensitive. A big part of today's infrastructure is the use of industrial control systems. Industrial control systems allow real-time monitoring of processes, such as, in many cases, manufacturing devices, for example, as well as what we call SCADA or SCADA networks, supervisory control and data acquisition systems. These systems can monitor things like traffic, whereas they will tell us if there are problems ahead on the highways, what is the approximate speed, and so that they can turn around and advise us of whether or not there's any things we should watch for as we're traveling down through a busy highway. Is there congestion ahead, for example? They also are used to control the flow of electrical power, water through dams. Many other systems today are real-time monitoring processes used in everything from managing elevators to managing manufacturing. These systems, of course, are incredibly valuable in the amount of information they provide for us, as well as the services they provide. These are provided through what we call PLCs, Programmable Logic Controllers. And a PLC then is a small little device that is really just gathering and processing data on our behalf. For example, an elevator usually runs on some type of a PLC that indicates for it when to stop, on which floor, when to respond, and so on. These are also used in distribution control systems, where we're looking at the distribution of everything from power, of course, to other types of manufacturing processes. They're used extensively in infrastructure controls and, obviously, in manufacturing. For example, we see them used extensively in the electrical power grid, traffic controls, as well as the monitoring of industrial processes. An invaluable part of today's critical infrastructure. But what is the risk? The risk is that many of these devices were written with languages and protocols that were initially developed in the 1970s. Things like DNP3, which is an insecure language because it was never built for being operated over a network such as the internet, and as a language has no inherent built-in security. In many cases, these devices are physically accessible. People can get access to them, and that would leave them susceptible to damage or theft. We also have the risk that most of these devices will actually communicate back to a control center using unencrypted transmissions, which means that those transmissions can not only be then observed, but also altered quite often in transit. And of course, many of these are now communicating through the internet. The problem with communicating through the internet is it allows virtually anyone to gain access to that device, which then can be used to alter its operation.